Welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician Licensing class, session number 5. We're going to start with digital modes and then carry on from there. So digital modes are a method of communicating using a series of protocols based on sending a sequence of ones and zeros that requires a computer to encode and decode the information. Digital modes, except Morse code, which is the original first digital mode, requires a form of RF modulation to enable transmission. Again, just as we've talked about earlier, low frequency or audio frequency or information needs to be carried by radio frequencies because it does not have sufficient energy to radiate from the antenna and transmit. So we're going to have some form of modulation to move these ones and zeros in the specific digital format through the air to another station or stations. Many modes have some type of error correction built in, and some of them have transmit and receive coordination built in. So error correction is the ability that when a piece of information is sent from one system, from one transceiver to another, there are certain things like checksums or parity checks that inform the receiving station if the section of information was passed correctly. And if it was passed correctly, that's fantastic. If it wasn't, it may have a way of sending a request to the originating station to resend the data that was damaged in transit. Additionally, there are some modes like we'll talk about FT8 and FT4 and JT65 that require both computers to be synced in time. And this is done by syncing them to a clock like the National Bureau of Standards, the atomic clock, so your computer has the most updated time. And some modes are relatively fast, and others are very slow, where slower modes ensure excellent copy but have limited capacity for information. So the nice thing about the slower modes is that they have built-in error correction, and they're able to be read by a computer in high noise conditions, sometimes even when you can barely hear it yourself. And so to do that kind of error correction to make sure that there's enough information being passed accurately, they're slower and therefore they have limited capacity for information. Whereas in faster modes, they take up more bandwidth and they can pass more information, but in high noise situations, they may not be effective. So in older radios, in order to do digital modes, you need to have some interface between the older radio and the computer. And the interface could be home built, the interface could be commercial. This one's a very popular one called SignalLink. It's USB, and what it does is it takes the audio from the speaker and uses that as the input sound to the computer that's going to decode that. And then when the computer wants to send, or you want to send information from the computer to the radio, it's going to put information into the audio inline or the microphone line. In some of the newer radios, the sound card, or what the function of the SignalLink did, is built into the radio itself. So now you can directly connect the radio to the computer and not have to have an intermediate box to interface them together. And in fact, the newest, and especially with QRP radios, there are some new QRP radios where FT8, which is a very popular digital mode, is actually built into the transceiver itself, and no computer is necessary to operate FT8. And so some of the newer QRP radios that run anywhere between 5 and 20 watts have that capability built into them using their own internal microprocessors to do, and sound cards, do all the decoding and encoding. Now here's some examples of some digital modes. Radio teletype, or otherwise called RTTY, is a 5-bit Baudot code, and it can use audio shift keying. Unfortunately, I didn't put that abbreviation in right, or frequency shift keying and it's from the 1930s. Originally, it was frequency shift keying, and then today we use it as audio shift keying because we use sound cards for the computer to do all the work. Originally, radio teletypes were a mechanical device interfacing to a radio, and you may have seen them in those old movies where they show news bureaus or the military sending out messages where there's a teletype or what looked like an electronic typewriter or like a printer with a keyboard, and they're sending messages through that device. This is very popular, especially with news services like Associated Press, United Press International, where they had reporters around the world They would aggregate that information together, and they would send it out to subscribers who were um, radio stations, TV stations, and newspapers. So they would have teletypes in their offices that are attached to the AP or UPI wire service, which would then pick up the messages. In the early days of amateur radio, we used the same equipment, basically surplus equipment from those days for radio teletype, and now it's all done in software. So those radio teletype equipment, the RTTY, is all basically in the museums now, but it's all done by audio. And it's still a very popular mode, and there are RTTY contests that go on once or twice a year. Another popular mode, well, was popular when I started in 2008, which was PSK31, phase shift keying, 31 baud, which is relatively low speed. It's an audio modulation mode using single sideband, so the bandwidth is about 3 kilohertz maximum, and it's for keyboard-to-keyboard comms, very much like texting, in the sense that you're typing a message, it's being sent out, the receiving unit is looking at that message, and then in response that they're sending a message back to you back and forth, as if you're having a conversation on the radio. You talk, then they talk, you talk, then they talk, etc. It was very popular. However, when Solar Cycle 24 was showing that it had very bad propagation, a lot of people moved to a new mode that had just come out called FT8, which was very much able to be more efficient in the situation where we had very bad signal propagation. And this led also to FT4. We also have other signal modes like JT65 and Whisper. There are probably about 100 different digital modes that are allowable. These modes are slow speed. They carry very limited information, but they have a high level of error correction. So they do carry information. They are very robust in the ability to send information, but they just can't send a lot of it, and they can't send it very fast. And these modes generally require time sync, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Pactor and Winmore are digital systems. Pactor is probably one of from the 1970s, and they feed into our WinLink system. And WinLink is a email system for radio that's propagated by radio. So we have servers around the world that people have put up voluntarily, and they collect emails. And then when you log on to it by radio, it recognizes you have a legitimate email address on the WinLink system, which is your call sign and the correct extension. It will then forward those emails to you. So the nice thing about it is the email might be sitting in, let's say, San Diego, and because you're on the East Coast, you're logging in at that point into a server that might be in New York. Once it recognizes that you're picking up the information from New York, any information from any other server, like in San Diego, would be forwarded to the one closest to you, and that you're linked into, and sent to you. The problem is it's only about 300 baud, so it's very slow. So you only can send basically text-based emails to be effective, but that can be enough for what you need. We don't need to send pictures we don't send pictures at 300 baud or large files, but to send simple text messages we can. And the nice thing about that is your people who don't have ham radio licenses, can have your WinLink email address, and they can actually reach you by WinLink when you're away from a cell phone situation. And vice versa, you can send people who are not radio amateurs email messages through the WinLink system as well. There's also digital voice, which is still not heavily used yet, but it's up and coming, and basically it's a way on HF to send your voice by having it digitally encoded. And of course, as I said, there are probably 100 different digital modes, but they're very much up to fashion. So FT8 became very fashionable, so a lot of people are not using PSK31 anymore. And so when things become fashionable, like anything else in fashion, people go to it, and it may be a while before they return back to some other modes. Or some other modes just may never be used again, like very, very rare to see HealthScriber being used, which is kind of like a fax machine on the radio. So let's look at a signal like FT8, and that stands for the Franke-Taylor 8 frequency shift keying modulation. It's got a bandwidth of 50 hertz. That's a very small bandwidth. So think about putting 25 or 35 watts into that bandwidth. It has a very, very strong power density. The software to decode it is WSJT. Now it's called WSJT-X. It's free. You do need to make sure you have time sync between your computer and the receiver's computer, and that's done with an add-on program that you can get that's also free, that will go out to the internet, find the atomic clocks on the internet, and then synchronize your home computer or whatever computer you're using for the FT8 mode, synchronize it to the atomic clock, and where the receiving unit is also synchronized, therefore they stay locked together. It's a 77-bit message block. I think Twitter is 140, but maybe that's 140 characters, which we'll see what that means in a second. You can we transmit in regular 15-second periods, whereas JT65 we transmit it in 1-minute periods. This was a big breakthrough, going to 15 seconds, but again, less information. And it consists of 12.64 seconds of transmission time and 2.36 seconds of decode time. Now that translates to a digital data rate of 6 bits per second, or like 5 words per minute. That's fairly slow. But it contains forward error correction, which allows it to be very robust in high noise or weak signal situations. So this is an example of WSJT-X software. What's interesting to point out, if you look in the lower left section, you'll see we have a frequency showed of 21.074 megahertz. This software runs with another plugin software library that actually does what's called CAT control, computer assisted tuning, which is kind of a bad term for the fact that we have the ability to take a computer and have it control a radio. So if the radio is equipped with CAT control, your computer can control that radio, whether it's sitting next to you or even if you put in the right software across the internet. So when I'm operating this mode in this software, I can change to the 15-meter band, the 10-meter band, the 20-meter band, the 40-meter band, etc. And it will automatically go, and it knows the band plan, so it will automatically give me the choices of where in the band plan for that band I can operate, let's say FT8. And it will then tune the radio to that automatically. It will then also be the system by which I trigger the radio to receive or to transmit. And so we have here on the right side generated standard messages. And what these are this is the length of the transmission. That's all you can put in there. So we've got various things like, VK68MA. This is VK1ERF. This is the one where the arrow pointing down is the second from the bottom. 73. What does that mean? 73 means goodbye, best regards. So that's a sign-off message. Okay. And so what we're doing here is we have the ability to click on the box, the radio button on the right where it says next, and have the computer automatically transmit that message when it's its turn to transmit. The numbers you see like -10 and R-10, those are all signal reports that are generated by the computer automatically. And RRR is basically asking for confirmation of reception. On the top left, we see the band activity. So we're decoding the different CQs. We're decoding who's answering. On the right side is where we're responding. And it tells you in the different color codes what the responses are to what my messages are as well. And so I won't go into all the different details on the software, but just to know that this is how you're operating your radio in the JT65, FT8, FT4 modes is through this software. I'm actually, once I'm attached to the computer, once I'm attached to any interface unit, I am not touching the controls on the radio. It's all being done through the software. The other one in this book says that packet and packet networks are the most common and popular mode on VHF and UHF, and the answer is probably not anymore. It's probably not very, there used to be a very heavy use of packet radio. There were national packet radio networks. These really don't exist too much anymore. Other modes have taken over from them, but there are some packet systems still available. But again, it's common on VHF and UHF because you have a higher baud rate. So remember I said that WinLink mail on the 80-meter band, for example, is about 300 baud. Here we're doing about 1200 or 9600 baud, which is about like a 1980s modem. That's how fast or slow as it might be. It's used on simplex channels, and you can see it listed here, 145.01 and 145.09 megahertz. It needs something called a TNC, which is a terminal node controller, which traditionally was a separate box. You can still buy them used or new today, mostly used. They're still relatively expensive. However, many of the TNCs now are emulated in software, or they're also so cheap to build with new modern microprocessors and SMD construction that you basically can pick up a TNC for some of the digital modes like APRS for $50 to $60. So versus the $200 or $300 the TNCs originally were at. So a terminal node controller today is mostly done in software. You don't have to sometimes you don't have to buy a separate box, and sometimes you can't do because it has a little bit more control over the radio that would be easier if it was slightly hardware, but they're relatively inexpensive. The transmitting packets are in frequency shift keying, which means we're not doing audio shifts in frequency. That is something you can hear. We're doing it in RF, so we're shifting the frequency to represent a 1 and a 0 using an RF frequency. And it consists of a header, a data, and then a checksum. And a checksum is a form of error correction, which says if a packet of data came to me, and when I added up all the data in the packet arithmetically, and it didn't come out to the checksum that was in the data packet, then I knew the data packet was not correctly received. And then the computer can send what's called an ARQ, which is an automatic repeat request, and that tells the transmitting computer, hey, I didn't get the right checksum, this data is bad, would you send that packet again? So this is not very different in certain respects than what happens on the internet today without a radio, is that your message that you're putting through your computer through the internet to another server or another computer is being broken up into packages, into packets. And they all have headers and datas and checksums. And these packets are taking routes to that server that you're trying to communicate with. They may not all take the same route. So when they're received at the server, there's information in the packets that allow the computer receiving them to put the packets back together in the right order, because you can have packets, because they're taking different routes sometimes to the server. A packet that should be the fourth packet could arrive first, and the first packet could arrive third, etc. And therefore we have information in the headers that tell the computer how to put the packets back together in the right order. So again, packets still exist, not as popular as it used to be. Was very popular, like I said, in the past when we were doing bulletin board systems, and their bulletin board systems predate the current way we use the internet with a browser. It was very text-based. You'd log on to what's called a bulletin board system. You would read messages there that could be to you or general topic messages, and then you could leave a message, and then when you logged off that computer, somebody else could log in and then read messages for them, or in general messages, and leave messages for others to look at. And that was a bulletin board system. You don't see a lot of those very much anymore because they've been superseded by what we have today. We also have, and this is very popular, automatic packet reporting system, and it generally is combined with a GPS receiver. However, it can be combined with a cell phone in some situations, so the cell phone towers provide the GPS information that are used in the packet. It's used to send location data. It can also send weather and short text messages. We also have the ability with our APRS-based radios that have the ability to create digirepeaters or gateways to forward the information to the internet or to extend the range of the transmissions. Just like a regular repeater, a digirepeater takes APRS data and retransmit it at another frequency that can be heard for a longer distance. And a gateway takes the APRS data that's coming into it and then sends it to the internet, where it's collected on a server for others to see or to get. And it's used for fun, but it's also used for public service events. So one of the things that can be done is that you can use it to each aid station, each medic, each judge who's judging different parts of a race, etc. Pace cars, whatever, can use an APRS-based amateur radio if they're a licensed operator, and then the controlling headquarter unit can now see where everybody is and how they're moving. So sometimes in let's say a ultra marathon, and there are a number in the Washington State area that are between 100 and 200 miles that are in the ultra marathon, they might give one of the runners, be carrying an APRS-based radio, and they're beaconing out their position, and so that can track basically where a crowd of runners are in any situation, or an aid station or a timing station might have one and can send information on in the text message about what's going on at that location limitedly, as well as using the radio as a radio, as you would for voice communications. However, with APRS, all the information is going to the internet. Somewhere along the way, it's going to go to a digirepeater and a gateway, and it goes to the internet, and you can go to aprs.fi, and you can now see all the APRS stations in your area or around the world. And if they're moving, you can actually put out you can indicate on the, as you can see on the right, you can indicate that you're tracking a call sign and you're tracking its motion. So you can see, for example, a car moving through a rally if it's got an APRS transmitter on it, or someone on a bicycle racer with a station, etc. You can see as they move through a space. So what we can do is to click on one of the dots, and we can then pull up some information about this. This is WA7FW, and we're getting some information about them and where they're located. And down, based on the APRS data, you can, again, like I said, you can do it for fun. Some people just you like to play with it for fun. Others do it for, like I said, public service events. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that most digirepeaters and gateways are located in urban areas. So once you leave an urban area, oftentimes you cannot get to a digirepeater or a gateway, and so your ability to do anything with APRS is very limited. However, if you're having a public service event, let's say a marathon run near Mount St. Helens, you can set up your own portable digirepeater network and take care of it locally in that way. So we're going to talk now about power supplies, because it's integral to being able to operate a station. There's some way to have to power the radio, the transceiver. It can be done through batteries, it can be done through power supplies, and it can be even done, if you want, through solar panels. So we're going to look at that in a sec right now. So power supplies, as I said just now, batteries are power converters. So a power converter converts 120 volts AC in the United States to 13.8 volts DC. And it's sized for the voltage need, current capacity, and regulation ability. So this is important. We size the power supply for the voltage need, number one. So we need, for most amateur equipment, 13.8, 13.6 volts. We have to know what the maximum current capacity of that radio is when we're transmitting. It could be 5 watts, it could be 20 watts, it could be 100 watts. We have to make sure that the power supply can meet that capacity and do it safely. So therefore, if your radio, when it's transmitting at full power, requires 30 amps, which is typical of a 100-watt radio, then to make sure your power supply will work properly, you at least probably should have it sized to handle current capacity greater than 30 amps, 35 amps, or 40 amps, and also regulation ability. So if you're converting that power supply from 120 volts AC to 13.8 DC, you want to make sure that when you put the maximum load on that power supply, like when you're transmitting, the power supply is able to maintain 13.8 volts. Or if it's even just idling in receive mode, you don't want to see your power supply varying 13.10 or 13.9 to 13.2. You don't want to see it constantly varying in voltage level. That's bad regulation. It's not good for the equipment. What you want to do is get a power supply that is keeping it as constant 13.8 as possible. Often when you're transmitting, even when you have a high current power supply, you may see when you're transmitting the voltage drop maybe 0.2 of a volt or so when you're transmitting. That's okay. And again, the regulation is the ability to maintain voltage or current level under a load. And then we have AC to DC conversion, which we have two types, which is linear power supplies, and they're great for regulation, but they're very, very heavy. So remember, with a transformer, we can step up or step down power. We can step up or step down voltage. And so if I have 120 volts AC, I need to move that down to 13.8 volts. Especially if it's a high current supply, it's going to need an iron core transformer, and it's going to be very, very heavy. So these linear power supplies tend to be very, very heavy to handle that kind of current, and they tend to be more expensive. However, One of the nice things about linear power supplies is they have very low noise. They don't put out a lot of RF noise. So they operate fairly quietly. Not as quiet as a battery, but very close to it. However, switching power supplies, their regulation is good to great. They're very light compared to linear power supplies. They're much cheaper than linear power supplies, but because of the way they convert the power from 120 volts AC to 13.8 DC, they have a high RF noise. And you need to take precautions to stop the noise, and sometimes you can't do anything about it, and there will be some places where you'll hear the noise in the different bands, different parts of the band as you're operating. Not necessarily something you can't live with, but it's something to know about, and something when you use those power supplies that there are things you can do with ferrite beads to help reduce that noise being transmitted or being propagated into your equipment. And then we have DC to DC conversion, which takes DC voltage within certain limits and converts it to 13.6 volts. So if you've got a sealed lead acid battery, which is putting out about 12.6 volts, but your equipment runs best at 13.6 volts, you can use a DC to DC conversion or converter to boost it up to 13.6 volts. However, the way it does that can produce some RF noise. So there's a trade-off there. However, in my experience, because I use these, it's better to have the 13.6 volts if you want the maximum output from your radio than to have a lower voltage. So I can live with a little bit of noise and accept a better operation or better output. But you can live with 12.6. However, modern radios have a cutoff voltage, which comes about it depends on the radio, between 10.5 and 11 volts. The radio will start to automatically shut itself off because it doesn't have enough voltage to operate properly, so it won't go any further down than that. So the other thing that we have to think about when we're putting power supplies to our transceivers is to make sure, again, the current carrying capacity, but that reflects also on the gauge of wire that we're going to use. So consider the gauge of wire given the current level and the distance between the power supply and the radio. When using long runs, use a gauge that can handle at least 50% more current to be safe. And you'll see that in a table in a minute. Of course, fuse both sides of the power line to the radio, and that's traditional in amateur radio equipment to put a fuse on both the positive and negative lead. And you connect the radio negative lead to the battery's negative terminal or where it's connected to the vehicle chassis in a mobile operation. And remember, if you connect direct to the car battery, you must manually turn the radio off. So if you have the radio on and you turn the car off and you're still connected to the battery, your radio is still running, and if you forget that, you'll kill the battery in the car. So if your radio can handle, in today's modern cars, runs at less than 10 amps, generally speaking, to be safe, no more than 8 amps or so, you can often plug that into the 12-volt auxiliary power cartridge, otherwise known as the old cigarette lighter or accessory device. And now it's connected to your ignition system, so therefore when the car is off, the radio has no power. When the car is on, then you can turn the radio on and off as you wish. But once you turn the car off, then it'll be off. However, if you're handling a lot more current, you're going to need to wire directly to the battery. Remember, you want to make sure that the radio is turned off when you turn off the car. So batteries, which is of course the most steady type of voltage until it depletes, we have different sizes, and this is out of your book, so take a look at that. And you can see that we have AA batteries, fully charged at 1.5 volts, and they have an energy rating average of 2.6 to 3.2 amps. So that's 2600 to 3200 milliamps. We can see things like the 9-volt disposable alkaline battery has a rating of 580 milliamps. And then we can go through that whole process. So, and then storage cells, depending on their lithium, when they have packs here in storage, so lithium ion and lead acid at the bottom last two, they're talking about a cell. We often have larger batteries that have many cells in them. And so yes, one cell is 3.3 to 3.6 volts for lithium ion, very rechargeable. But oftentimes to get, of course, if you think about it, we're going to need at least five of those cells in series to get the 13 volts that we need. So how long will the battery run on my device? So you divide the energy rating of the average current draw for the device. So again, when we have a transmitter, we could be transmitting, we could use 20 watts. That might be 10 amps of power on a radio. And most of the time we're going to be in receive mode, which is probably, half an amp, 500 milliamps. And so we do is we divide the energy rating by the average current draw for the device, and that gives us how much time that'll run. So if you take a 600 milliamp battery, and you need you need 200 milliamps to run, then you can only run for 600 divided by 300 milliamps, and that gives you the time that you have available, milliamp hours. So in this case, it would be 3 amp hours. Now, NiCad lead acid batteries can vent hydrogen when charged, and if the charge rate is too high, that it may be producing more hydrogen than it's designed to vent, it may cause an explosion. Very rare that this happens today, and this can happen in situations where the battery might be old, or the battery might have not been properly designed, the casing, to vent it at high charge rates. And so it's very important to always charge and store in well-ventilated areas. You don't see a lot of NiCad batteries in modern radios today, but they are still available in older radios. So let's talk about some of the licensing regulations. Now, as we get into this, you'll probably know that I'm leaving some of the things out from the chapter, and it's because several of the items in this section we've already covered in the first and other sessions. So when you go through this chapter, you'll recognize that some of the things that are in the book we've covered in other sessions. So let's talk about the amateur radio license. One, there's no age limits or citizenship restrictions, except you can't be a foreign representative. So if you work as a foreign agent, if you're part of an embassy or a consulate, if you're a foreign representative, you cannot get an amateur radio license. However, if you are not one of those people, you can get a license no matter what your citizenship is. And a lot of people who are overseas who come to operate, come and visit the United States for a period of time, that is find that they might get a U.S. license, and vice versa. There are places where you're visiting, like in a de-expedition, where you're going to a country to operate specifically to get other amateurs around the world to contact you because they need that country. You'll often need to get a license for that country, and there's certain rules that allow you to either get reciprocal license, which means you file the paperwork and they automatically will give you a license in their country, or you may have to take their test depending on their laws. Yes, and there are no age limits, which means the youngest ham radio operator I've ever seen licensed was 7 years old as a technician, and the oldest I've ever seen licensed is about 82. So that tells you there's no age limit. It just depends on your motivation to learn the material or memorize the material. And there's two parts to our license. There's the operator part of the license, which is you, the user of the radio, and the other is the station license, which the call sign is attached to, and that's the authorization for you to have a station. So we have these two pieces. If you were, let's say, as a broadcaster, you may have an operator's license because it means that you're talking on the radio and you're authorized to use the radio to broadcast, to talk, or play music if it's a broadcast commercial station. But there's the person who owns that radio station will have the station license, which is the thing that authorizes them to have a transmitter. And clubs with at least 4 members can hold a license. So that's why many repeaters that we see in this area or other areas around the country are owned by clubs, and they use their club call sign. So for example, the Mike and Key Club here in Western Washington has a series of repeaters, and their license is K7LED. The terms of a license are 10 years. They're renewable within 90 days of expiration, which means you cannot renew this license when you're 95 days from expiration. The system will just kick you out and say, wait till you're within 90 days. If it expires, you must immediately stop operating. The minute it expires, you are done operating. If it expires, you do have a 2-year grace period to apply without taking the test again. So therefore, if you do apply again within less than 2 years, you don't have to take the test again. Other than that, you take the test again. So there are 3 license classes currently: technician, general, and extra. There have been historically other licensing classes. There was a novice class, as we've talked about before, which is a temporary license that was designed to get you started, and then you'd need to move on to either a technician, no-code technician at the time, or a general. And between general and extra, there was another license level called advanced. So you'll see, like we showed the band chart before, we have an N, G, T, G, A, and E levels on the band chart because those people who had licenses of those other classes have been grandfathered in. But you can only apply for an extra general or technician license today. And this is an example of an amateur radio license. This is actually my license with a couple of changes made. And you know, they're not fancy. They basically, you print them out now. They don't even send anything in the mail to you. You go up online and you get a printout, and you then put one in your station if you're at home and one in your wallet if you're operating mobile. You can actually get, some people laminate these paper licenses for their wallet. There's actually a few services that will print them on a nice heavy piece of plastic for your wallet as well. And to actually get the printout, you have to go to the FCC ULS. You have to go to that specific URL and follow directions to get your printout license for the official copy. There is an unofficial copy you can get when you just do a search on your license. But to actually get your official copy, you need to go through that link to find it. So how do you lose your license? Because people do lose their licenses. First and foremost, and these are mostly doing it on a habitual level, interfering with other amateurs, interfering with people who have primary frequency allocation, and there are some like the 60 and 30 meter band. Amateur radio operators are secondary allocation. Therefore, if someone else is already there and they're the primary allocation, you have to not be there. You have to be quiet. And if you operate outside of the amateur service, you're only allowed to operate outside the amateur service on one situation, and that is the immediate threat to life or property. You can transmit outside of the amateur service for that reason. Other than that, you can't. You also can lose your license if you fail to maintain a current email and mailing address in the ULS that can cause the return of FCC notification to you. So you don't have to use your actual physical location of your house. If you want to open a P.O. box and make that your address, you can totally do that. But typically, you generally, if the FCC wants to send you something, if it bounces back, there's a good chance that they might say, we can't contact you in the way you're supposed to be contacted. We are now terminating your license. And remember, when you have a license under Part 97, you're opening your station for inspection. Just your station, nothing else. So if they knock on your door and say, hey, we want to inspect your station, technically they can do that. Now, do they do that? Only if you've been a blatant, repeated person who's interfering and not responding to their emails and mailing addresses for cease and desist. Then they're going to come and basically knock on your door. They're probably not going to inspect your station. They're going to seize it, and they're going to cancel your license and give you a bill. And the bill is your fine, up to $10,000 a day for as many days as you're in violation. And of course, you can lose your license permanently, or I guess you can never get a license, if you operate without a current license. So let's just go back here. We've seen this chart before. This is the technician license allocations. Basically, from VHF and above, you have the same allocation as everybody else. The only place that it's different is in the HF allocations. So hint, hint, know your HF allocations. And the fact that you're limited to 200 watts when you're operating in the HF areas. And of course, anything above 2.3 gigahertz is going to be open to you to play with. And of course, we have the ability to do a lot of types of computer mesh networking and such at those upper frequencies. And this we showed before. This is the U.S. amateur chart. This is the federal version. Remember, the detailed band plan is voluntary, and it's by agreement of the amateurs in, for all intents and purposes, North America. And so here we're seeing the federal band chart where our allocations are. And we use must use the minimum power necessary to carry out communications. So technically, if you're using 200 watts, technically you're making a really strong contact. Technically, you should start throttling back the power until such time as there may not be as readable as it should be for 100% copy, and then bring the power back up. So do people do that? Sometimes. I can't say it's something that's commonly I hear people doing, but technically they should. And then here are all your HF allocations. As you can see, it's just from the chart that we had just a few seconds ago. And here are all the things 6 meters and above. You notice every allocation for you is exactly the same as for the extras and generals. And so some people, technicians, never upgrade to general because they're happy with a lot of the VHF, UHF spectrum that they have and a lot of the communications they do or experimentation they do. Now let's talk about third-party traffic. And third-party traffic is when an amateur radio operators exchange or facilitate the exchange of a message from a non-amateur to another using a radio. And so, for example, let's say somebody comes up, there's a disaster. They know you're an amateur radio operator, and they say, could you get a message to my cousin in Cincinnati to tell him we're okay? Who's not an amateur radio operator? Yes, you could, technically. It may not be happening to them within minutes, but it will happen to them because you can then call out to operators and get that message passed through one amateur radio operator to another until it gets to the end of the line in Cincinnati, and given that person's address or phone number, that ham radio operator might walk over and give them the message or call them on the phone, etc. We even have what's called the National Traffic System, which has been around for a long time. And if you think about it, the amateur radio organization that represents hams in the United States is the Amateur Radio Relay League. It's over 100 years old. Think of the name. The name comes from setting up a network of radio relays across the country to get messages through. Today, it's a national traffic system, and it goes back to that original idea. And you will hear, if you're in different frequencies, you'll hear the national traffic system get on. It's 5:30. Hi, this is W7DAO for the National Traffic System. Do you have any traffic for us? And they hear nothing. They'll say, okay, here, no traffic. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow. And they do this every day. And a third-party supervision is what's happening. What's happening is you're passing traffic. It could be a written message. It could be someone who comes to your shack and you're allowing them to use voice communications. You are the control operator. You're in charge, and you're supervising the voice communications from your station as they talk to another person, for example, who is in another station somewhere else, who is not the operator but is being supervised by the operator. And actually in the Korean War and in the Vietnam War, this was often how loved ones would speak to service people in overseas, is using this kind of setup through a military system called MARS, the Military Amateur Radio Service, which facilitated these kind of social or communications between family members who were serving overseas and to domestic locations. And you can only share third-party traffic between countries if the third-party agreement is in place. In your book, there's a list of countries that have signed third-party agreements. If there's no third-party agreement, you cannot pass third-party traffic to those countries. And as we explained what the National Traffic System is. So what are the prohibited communications? So obscene or indecent speech is prohibited. So bottom line, you want to keep it clean. Are there people who abuse this? Yes. Do they abuse it by accident? Yes. Are there people who abuse it on purpose and repeatedly to the point of interference? Yes. And we try to hopefully get those people to cease and desist through different ways. However, if you're hearing somebody who is doing this kind of thing or being interfering with a net or anything else in any way, the best thing to do is not engage them, not start trying to discipline them on the air, because that just feeds them. And so the best thing to do is just move the frequency and ignore them. Also, the one of the things you can't do, if an activity like boating, for example, which has an allocation in the Marine band, you cannot have boating traffic about moving boats around and controlling boat traffic or things like that on amateur radio, because they have their own allocation and it should be done on that band. You cannot operate a business or do communications for compensation. So someone can't pay you as an amateur radio operator to operate your radio, except in two situations. One is in the book, one for some reason they did not put in the book. The first one is if you're a teacher using ham radio as part of a class, you're allowed to do that because your job is primarily teaching, not operating the radio. The second place is you could be a hospital employee who's been given the task of using the radio to communicate on behalf of the hospital. There was a waiver a few years ago for that and allows you to do that because your job is primarily not to operate the radio. However, you cannot conduct any business on the radio like, hey, I've got car for sale, I'm offering great deals for ham radio operators at the Dunkin' Donuts, whatever it is. You can't do that. However, you can do a radio swap meet on the radio. That's allowed for hobbyists. So I can say, I'm selling my radio. Anybody interested in it, please give me a call. And as I said, teachers can use this as part of the class. And of course, you cannot have encrypted transmissions. No encrypted transmissions. And it looks like all that with data we're encrypting because we're using different types of modes like FT8 and Whisper, and they look like we're encrypting, but we actually aren't because we publish those formats on the internet and other places. Excuse me, and therefore anyone could build a radio receiver and software and decode what we're sending. So we don't encrypt. The only times we encrypt is if we're using radio control or control of space stations. Remember, a space station is any transceiver that's 50 kilometers above the Earth. That's a space station. We're not just talking about the International Space Station. It's any radio that's 50 kilometers or higher above the Earth. So what you want to do is you don't want anyone taking control of your, let's say, radio-controlled airplane or taking control of your transceiver as it orbits the Earth. So those may be encrypted. So the last thing I'll talk about is you can't broadcast. And I may have mentioned this a little bit already. You can't have one-way communications except for code practice, information bulletins, or when needed due to an emergency. So for example, here is a typical broadcast that's allowed that I do once a month. The Mike and Key Technical Net, which I host the first Wednesday of every month at 7:30, when it's 7:25, I get on the radio and I say, QST, QST, this is to inform you that the technical net will start at 7:30 p.m. I do this because I'm telling anyone who's about to use the repeater to please not use the repeater. We have a net going on. And those who are interested in joining the net, who are starting to tune in to listen, are confirming that, yes, there is going to be a net going on. But that is one of the allowable one-way communications. You also may not assist in news gathering. No transmission of music or other entertainment material, except music from the space station. I don't know why when it's a space station it's allowed, but it's allowed. Now, what does this mean? It means that if you're driving your car and you're starting to transmit, turn off your radio. Turn off your radio that has music and news and things on it. That's incidental transmission. So that's not legal. So you want to turn that down or off, ideally. And so that's what you cannot do. And then repeaters, space stations, auxiliary stations can retransmit on other frequencies or bands. So that's allowed. That technically could be looked at as broadcasting, but we make that exception that they're not broadcasting because they're just moving it to another frequency, and that's okay. So that's the other exceptions. So that is pretty much what we mean by no broadcasting. As those of you who took the class know, that at this point in time in the class we did two simulated nets sort of simulated 2-meter nets. One was a social net and the other was an emergency communications net. We're not going to do that, of course, in the recording, but just wanted you to know that we did that. And if you have any questions, of course, email me at w7dao@arrl.net. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to our next session.